It's a great pleasure to be here. And I should mention at the beginning that even though my network and number of collaborators is not quite as large as IPBES, as you'll hear later, but I want to acknowledge that this work was done in collaboration with a large network of co-authors and supporters and institutions around the world. So, and I think this is the main challenge I think that we face today. How do we create a better world, a well-being future? And I understand that well-being doesn't translate quite perfectly into Japanese, so maybe quality of life might be a better translation. But how do we create a world that provides security, prosperity, equity, and sustainability that allows us to continue the quality of all life, really, on the planet, and think of the system in an integrated whole system way. Why is this so important now? Well, we live in the Anthropocene, an era when human impacts on our life support system have become extremely large, as has already been mentioned. And I think that means that we live in a full world, full of humans and their artifacts, and we have to take on the challenge to build economies and societies that are based on a different goal, rather than the single-minded pursuit of GDP growth, as if that would solve all of our problems. In fact, we know that the side effects of at least our current approach to growth have created many of the problems that we're talking about. So we need to establish a different, more comprehensive goal about sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, recognizing that the implications of that phrasing, that it's not humans and nature as separate things, it's humans embedded in the rest of nature. So what do we need to create that sustainable well-being future? Well, first of all, we need an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding, which is certainly progressing rapidly as we learn more about biodiversity, as we'll hear a bit later, but also Earth system science and positive psychology, what actually contributes to humans' individual and social well-being. But we also need an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What's our vision for the future? And can we create a truly shared vision of this positive future? To do that, we're going to need tools and analytical techniques that involve more systems thinking, more whole systems thinking, and modeling in order to understand how this complex interdependent system functions. And we're also going to need some different kinds of implementation strategies and institutions, I think, that can better handle managing our common assets, like the atmosphere, like our natural and social capital. And as I'll point out, I think we're going to need some societal therapy as well to help us overcome our lock-in or addiction to the current system. So on the science side, we know the world's a complex, nonlinear adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. And as I said, our understanding of some of these phenomena is growing rapidly. This is just a representation of some of the potential tipping points in the climate system, including the ice sheets melting, the Amazon drying. There's a whole range of different potential tipping points that could cause the climate to change much more rapidly than has been projected. We know that we, for example, are outside the safe operating space in terms of these 9 planetary boundaries, as they've been called, including climate change and biodiversity loss, land use change, freshwater change, et cetera, biogeochemical flows. So we're close to these potential tipping points in many areas, and we're not in a safe area. One way of looking at that is that, during the Holocene period, we had a relatively stable climate that allowed human civilization to develop. Now we're in the Anthropocene. We're in danger of flipping to a hothouse Earth because of these tipping points. And our challenge really is to stabilize the system and to get into a zone of climate that will allow civilization to continue. All right, so we know a lot about what the problems are. We know a lot also, I think, about what the solutions are, and we have known them for a long time. But that's still not the movie that many people are lining up to go see. It's too easy to believe that things are fine, it will work out, technology will save us, etc. So it's an inconvenient truth, and change is hard. So what do we need to make that change? I think we need a third movie. I think we need a much more positive vision of what a sustainable and desirable economy in society, in the rest of nature, could look like, and recognize that embeddedness and recognize the interdependence of the economy and society and the environment. So I think that's an essential first step, is to recognize that interdependence and to begin to think of this as a complex system. Another way of looking at it is that we need to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also need to create all of the elements of well-being, quality of life, et cetera. We need to stay within what Kate Raworth has called the safe and just donut. So how do we create all of those things in this sustainable future? Ecological economics from the beginning has been about doing just that. And it is a transdisciplinary field. It's not ecology or economics separately. It's really trying to bring together both of those fields, but also several other fields, and toward these common goals or questions of creating this ecologically sustainable scale, staying within planetary boundaries, basically, but also a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between the current and future generations, and between humans and other species. So how do we distribute wealth and resources fairly? And finally, an economically efficient allocation of resources. How do we allocate resources, all of the resources that contribute to sustainable well-being? And many of those are outside the market system, like our natural and social capital assets. So ecological economics, I think, was among the first of these ideas headed in that direction, but I think there are several others that are very similar and that overlap in their agenda, and we shouldn't be confused that they're competing ideas. I think these are all complementary ideas, including the well-being economy, the circular bioeconomy, the regenerative economy. The Chinese are talking about ecological civilization, the donut economy I mentioned, and Herman Daly has advocated the steady state economy. Herman Daly was a previous laureate of the Blue Planet Prize and a co-creator, I think, of this field of ecological economics with me, et cetera. So a key contributor to this sustainable well-being is this idea of ecosystem services, all of the benefits that humans derive from functioning ecosystems. This diagram is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that categorized those services into these four basic groups: provisioning services like food and fresh water, regulating services like climate regulation and flood prevention and regulation, cultural services like recreation and aesthetic and spiritual contributions, and supporting services like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, and all of the connections between those many things that functioning ecosystems do that contribute to various categories or constituents of human well-being. There is one thing missing from this diagram, however, and that's the connection or the interaction with the other forms of capital assets that we have on planet Earth. So it's natural capital doesn't flow directly into sustainable well-being. It requires the interaction with people to have the benefits, some built infrastructure, and our social capital, all of our interactions among people, our institutions, our governments, our networks. And so the challenge, I think, is understanding this complex interaction and balancing and how natural capital contributes to that and creates sustainable human well-being. It best will be talked about after this one, but I think that's one of the major things happening to further this agenda in terms of understanding ecosystem services. There's also the Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is a global network of researchers and practitioners that are working on this topic. So if you want to learn more about who's doing what in this field and join this partnership, you can take a look at their website. There's been rapidly expanding scientific interest in this topic. This is just a plot of the number of articles on the topic of ecosystem services over the last several years. You can see there's now more than 6,000 articles per year published, and almost 60,000 total articles on this topic of ecosystem services. So IPBES has their hands full in terms of trying to synthesize all of this stuff, as does the Ecosystem Services Partnership. But it just goes to show that there is enormous scientific interest in this field. And I think that's what the Blue Planet Prize has acknowledged. The most highly cited of all of those papers is this one that we published back in 1997, which has already been mentioned, where we tried to estimate with a capital E and conservatively the total value of 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, and came up with a total that was significantly larger than global GDP at the time. One thing that we didn't control, we did get the cover of the magazine, which was great, but we didn't control what they put on the cover, and they said pricing the planet. We didn't really mean pricing as much as valuing, recognizing that most of these services are not traded in markets and should not be traded in markets. Really, they're public goods and common property. But we can value them in terms that are comparable with some of the things that are traded in markets and traded and express them in monetary units, just to highlight the magnitude of their importance. So there are some misconceptions about this valuation of ecosystem services that have arisen, I think, because of that mistake. And also the idea that ecosystem services is somehow a very anthropocentric concept, that it's just about what nature can do for us. And I think that's not really accurate. I think ecosystem services is more about the whole system and how interdependent we are with the rest of nature, and how we benefit from that, the things that the rest of nature is doing, and how we impact the rest of nature as well. That valuation in monetary or in any units is really not the same as privatization. It's not a precursor to privatizing these ecosystems. It really is a better way of understanding how they contribute to our well-being. So those two things are not the same, and we certainly should guard against privatization of some of these services, but valuation does not necessarily help to do that. And that this idea of intrinsic values is often put in opposition to valuation, and say, oh, we should preserve the natural systems simply for their own sake, for their intrinsic value. And I don't think that's, or it shouldn't be in opposition to valuation, which is a different kind of thing. Intrinsic values are really more about assigning rights to natural systems, and not necessarily about valuation, which is about understanding trade-offs. And also that we can't avoid this valuation exercise, because every time we make decisions about ecosystems in a world of trade-offs, we're implicitly valuing them. We're saying one thing is more important than another. So all we're really trying to do with this valuation exercise is make that more explicit. There's a whole range of possible uses for this valuation of ecosystem services, including just raising interest and awareness, but also national income accounting, specific policy analysis, urban and regional land use planning. How do we plan our landscapes to maximize the total value, the total contribution to sustainable well-being? Payment for ecosystem services. How do we use economic incentives to help preserve and produce many of these ecosystem services? How do we use it for full cost accounting? We know that the market is not telling us the truth about anything we buy, really, because of all the external costs that are not included in the prices that we pay, but they could be if we understood what those implications or those external costs were. And this idea of common asset trust. How do we manage these ecosystem services more as community assets and common assets and as trusts, where they're managed for the value that they contribute to the whole community. So on the idea of national income accounting, several countries have recently begun this process of measuring and valuing their ecosystem services and folding them into to their national income accounts. China, the US, and several other countries, including Australia, have started this process. There's a new open access ecosystem services valuation database with over 10,000 individual valuation estimates collected from the literature, and this is growing substantially as many of those papers that I mentioned can be incorporated. And this is something that can be used to help with this valuation exercise. We used an earlier version of that to try to estimate the changes in the global value of ecosystem services from that 1997 estimate up until 1914, or in this case. And basically due to land use change, to desertification, to deforestation, to loss of coral reefs, we estimated that we've lost about $20 trillion a year on the value of these ecosystem services. We're currently working on an update to this estimate to see if we've been able to arrest that change, or if we're headed down the sort of conventional market forces kind of scenario, which would lead to continuing loss in ecosystems and biodiversity in the services they provide. Or can we arrest that change and at least stabilize things? Or can we implement the great transition? Can we really restore, conserve, rebuild many of the ecosystems we need to provide those services? That's the natural capital side, but there's also the equally important social capital side. How do we build a society that's more equitable, that contributes to our quality of life through the contribution of our communities, et cetera. We know that, as this graph shows, the relationship between income inequality and a whole range of health and social problems is fairly direct. The more unequal a country is, the higher this rate of health and social problems. We also know that GDP per capita contributes to our sustainable well-being, but in a very sort of diminishing returns kind of way. This is a plot of GDP per capita versus mean life satisfaction from surveys where they ask people, how satisfied are you with your life? And you can see that it goes up quickly at first, but levels off and begins to taper off quite quickly as well. Why is that? Well, we know that GDP was never designed as a measure of societal well-being. It really only measures marketed economic activity, some of which is good and some of which is really to be avoided. But even the original architects of GDP knew that and warned against using it for that purpose. But unfortunately, that's what we have been using GDP for. But it's time for that to change. And I think there's growing recognition that GDP should be replaced with more comprehensive kinds of measures. And here's a subset of just a few of them. We actually did a study recently and found that there are over 400 alternative measures to GDP that are out there in the world. This is just a subset, just to show the different categories. Some of them modify GDP in various ways. The Genuine Progress Indicator, which I'll talk a little bit more about, does that. Some of them are sort of direct surveys of life satisfaction, like the World Values Survey and the World Happiness Report, which I'll mention a bit later. And some of them are indices built up from a whole range of different indicators that are put together, like the OECD Better Life Index is a more recent one of those, and the Human Development Index was one of the first. The Life Satisfaction Surveys, the World Happiness Report, which comes out every year now, ranks countries according to their the average life satisfaction that people report in surveys. But one interesting thing they do is try to decompose that and say, well, how much of the variation across countries is due to these various factors? And they find that GDP per capita only explains about 15% of the variation across countries, whereas social support, healthy life expectancy, some social and natural and human capital components, generosity, other things explain a bit more. They haven't explained all of the variation. They left out the natural capital components, I think, from this survey. But the point is that GDP does not contribute everything. Japan doesn't rank in the top 10 in these life satisfaction surveys either. Anyway, another indicator that we've worked on is called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which starts with personal consumption, which is a major component of GDP, but then it weights that by income distribution to get at the inequality component. We know that that's extremely important. It adds a few things that are left out, like household labor and volunteer work. And then it subtracts a bunch of things that shouldn't be counted as positive. The cost of crime. If there's more crime, you have to have more police, you have to have more security devices. That adds to GDP and economic activity, but it's not a good thing. If we have more water pollution, air pollution, loss of wetlands, climate change, those are all not necessarily good things. So we need to be subtracted. When you do that, and we did one study, we tried to assemble what had been done at the global scale, you see that over time, even though GDP per capita was going up, GPI per capita tracked it for a while till about 1980 or so. But then we moved from a period of true economic growth to what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. The economy is still growing, but it's not really economic. It's not contributing to this net sustainable welfare or well-being. And GPI has been actually decreasing slightly over that time period. So we're really addicted to this current conception of what the goal for the system should be, when in fact we know that it's not producing the sustainable well-being that we want. So what do we have to do to change things? We have to, I think, break our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption in high-income countries, and to inequality. And a key step in that therapy to break that addiction is really building a shared vision of what this more sustainable and desirable future looks like, the one that focuses on well-being and the well-being of all humans and the rest of nature. So one thing we've been doing some research on recently is to look at what can we learn from what works to overcome individual addictions, and can we scale that up to the societal scale? And one therapy that seems to work quite well is something called motivational interviewing, which doesn't confront addicts with their problem directly, but rather engages them in a positive discussion of their goals, their life goals, and what kind of future they want for themselves. And once that's been established, then that can motivate the difficult changes in the short term to help achieve those goals. And this is, I think, a relatively common technique for making difficult changes in all kinds of institutions and societies and businesses. You have to have a clear goal of what you're trying to achieve before you can make those kinds of changes. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, I think are a major step in that direction at the societal scale. All countries in the world have signed on, to trying to achieve these goals by 2030, and they certainly do represent all of the things that need to be included in a sustainable, well-being kind of future. I'm sure you've seen some version of these before, but they have to do with preserving natural capital, with dealing with climate urgently, with no poverty, no hunger, reducing inequality, renewable energy, etc. So I think they include most of the things that really are needed there. Another way of looking at that, the kind of future that we want, and is to try to lay out alternative futures. What are the plausible futures that are possible? And this is one version of that the Great Transition Initiative have come up with. Can we have a future that continues to focus on GDP and individualism, the sort of business as usual future? Can we have a more policy reform future that's more community oriented? Or can we have a great transition that really focuses on well-being, quality of life, and the larger community? And I think the SDGs fit well into that Great Transition Initiative. But how do we communicate those alternative futures to a larger audience, to the general public? And I think to do that, we're going to need more help from the arts community, from the humanities, and to be able to describe what would life be like in these alternative futures, and why it would be a better world, or at least a different world, and allow people to make those choices and have that discussion. We did in Australia a public opinion survey across these 4 scenarios for the country, changing the terminology a bit, but talking about community well-being rather than the great transition and free enterprise, etc. But we found that with a representative sample of over 2,000 Australians, the vast majority preferred this community well-being scenario. That's the kind of world that the kind of country that they would really want, one that was more equitable, more sustainable, etc. But we also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and they said it was headed more towards the continuing the free enterprise future. Another set of scenario surveys that have been done recently looked at across several different countries and broke it down into just these 2 scenarios of the business as usual or the sustainable scenario, and found that all countries, really, in all countries, the sustainable scenario was much more highly desired than the business as usual scenario. So how do we get that message across, and how do we use that to build a shared vision of what that sustainable society could look like, and build it enough of a critical mass and a movement of movements to get us there? I'm going to skip these 2 in the interest of time, and maybe come back to them in the question and answer period, about what kinds of institutions that we might want to build to get to this sustainable future that might be based on Elinor Ostrom's idea of how to govern sustainable systems, and how we might apply that at the whole system level. We proposed an Earth atmospheric trust, really, as one way to get there. But I'll focus more on why we need, I think, a movement or a movement of movements, and how we can build that movement to help us overcome this addiction to growth. I've been involved in helping to set up something called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a group of not only institutions and individuals, but a few countries as well, that have begun to take on this role of well-being as their primary focus rather than GDP growth. So I think it is going to take a movement of movements to really motivate the kinds of changes that we need to build this sustainable well-being future. And if you want to know more about any of the things that I've been talking about, these are 3 recent books that have come out that go into more detail. And I'll end there. Thank you.